Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and today's video is going to take a look at a device that's still in use today, which is basically the hand grenade. Now if you look at modern hand grenades, they are very efficient and they're really used to clear a lot of people out of an area. In other words, it's predominantly used as an anti-personnel handheld bomb basically. Now, the origins of the hand grenade, like I said, still in use today, do actually go back a very, very long way in history. For example, we know that wars and sieges in ancient times often use something that is referred to as Greek fire, and I don't know if anyone's ever heard of that before, and we're not 100% sure what that was. All we know is it was an incendiary device that caused vast amounts of damage. The best thing we can say is it was probably some sort of container that held combustible material. So that could be something as simple as straw and wood, but there is an ignition device attached to it. So there would have been some form of fuse, and attached to that would have been something that burns ferociously, and we often call it Greek fire. It was probably something like sulfur mixed in with all sorts of things, from tar to oils, for example, and they would have been used in sieges, not necessarily on battlefields, to get rid of a lot of people from vulnerable points. For example, if you're on, for example, an old ancient wall, let's say the walls of Troy, for example, you could throw these things down and it will create panic and will create fire and move people away. People will flee away from this horrible burning weapon. Now, by the Middle Ages, they were still using something similar. So I've used these pictures before. This is from the Osprey book, and what you will see in that picture here, hopefully you can see it anyway, are things being thrown down on attackers. So here we have a barrel, for example, and there is a very obvious fuse attached to it. So that is probably full of tar, linseed oil, maybe vast quantities of wood packed in there, sulfur and all sorts of things. And it's one of the best ways of, once again, removing people, and that's what grenades are. It's a way of removing people from the area that you're in. They work better in confined spaces than they do in the open. That's one of the reasons why you see them in sieges and not necessarily in battles. But then we also have, in the medieval period, something known as a fire pot, and these get mentioned quite a bit, and once again these are usually linked with siege warfare. Now by this time we know that they were often a clay container, nothing more than a jug really, or a pot, and then attached to the top would have been something to light, and then once you lit it you would throw it, it would fall down, crack open, and then things like the combustibles, maybe even gunpowder, and remember we spoke about gunpowder when we were looking at the very early medieval handgun, would have spread everywhere and started fire. Now in this picture, and hopefully you can see it, there is a man there actually holding what is referred to as a fire pot, and this is taken from descriptions of the age. So what we have is some pottery container, and you will also notice there's smoke coming out of it. So he's lit what would be a fuse, and he's about to cast it down onto the attackers of the castle or city wall. But the interesting thing then is you don't hear of them that often in post-medieval times until you have references to grenades being used, for example, during the Spanish Armada. Spanish troops, for example, were said to throw Granados, as they often refer to them, throw Granados onto the decks of English ships, and they would roll around and explode. Some of them would actually drop down into the belly of the ship, and if you think of Royal Navy ships, there's gunpowder dotted around, because obviously the Spanish Armada was a naval action, and you could end up blowing up the whole ship with these horrible little things called a granado. But we do have them definitely being used in the 17th century, for example, during the English Civil Wars. And what I've got here is one of those early Granados, or as we were calling them in England, the grenade. And these were made usually out of pottery, like this one here. Some of these were even made out of glass. We have references to glass ones. Unbelievably expensive, to be fair. And these probably would have been mass produced from bottles as well. If you think of a castle or a home under siege in the Civil War, you could take bottles, fill it with gunpowder and attach a fuse to the top. On the top of this one, we have some rope that's been soaked in a chemical called saltpeter, which I mentioned when we were talking about the early handguns. And this could be lit and then once again cast off a castle wall or rolled into a group of attackers at a city gate, for example. They were not very good, we know that for a fact. If these actually hit the ground and smashed, just like the early fire pots, all they will do is the gunpowder would ignite. It would be a large flash, a lot of smoke, and probably any of the attackers nearby would have burnt hair on their legs. That's pretty much it. The idea of these things is they really need to explode in the air, because when they explode in the air, the explosion is intensified, just like it would be if you put gunpowder in a barrel, and this thing will crack, shatter, throwing either broken glass or broken pottery literally into the bodies of the people nearby. So these things are quite lethal, but the problem is you have to time the fuse perfectly, and if you don't soak the rope, the fuse in saltpeter long enough, you could end up having it not being able to light. You could also have it so it burns down too quickly. There's a lot of problems, and you've also got the atmosphere. If it's raining, if it's cold, you may not have the fuse going off when you actually need it, and the worst thing that can happen is these things could be thrown back at you. In the Siege of Gloucester and the Siege of Worcester, we do get a mention of them being thrown over the walls, for example, and we have even accounts of people coming out into the street and throwing buckets of water on them to put them out. So they're not brilliant. But then eventually, by the time you get the Restoration, and more importantly during the 18th century, the Georgian period, grenades are still around, and they're still technically being used by soldiers in siege warfare. Now, they do start to have a specialist soldier. So as well as having your bog standard infantrymen, they did start having what was referred to as grenadiers. And grenadiers are technically the people that throw grenades. Even today in the British Army, when there is an attack, usually you have a designated grenadier who actually throws the grenade. At one point in history, they even had a badge. And the interesting thing is, the badge was one of these, a granado, a grenade. But by the 18th century, there were grenadiers, and they would have been throwing grenades like this one. These would have been made hollow and would have been made out of iron. And at the top there, you have a piece of wood with a hole in it. And as you can see, there is also a fuse in the top, very much like the other ones, except these were starting to be, I wouldn't say industrially made, but they were starting to be made more effective. They were starting to work better, and more importantly, they were more effective as in the timing of the fuse burn down was much better. In other words, these generally didn't go off in the hands of the thrower, basically. So you set fire to the fuse and then you launch the thing, and obviously these are not going to break when they hit the floor. They will sit there fizzing away and then eventually going off, exploding, sending splinters of iron and burning anything it's near, really. But by the end of the 18th century, there wasn't really a need for grenades, granados, that sort of thing. So there is a bit of a lull in grenade production. They've become that ancient weapon that has been around for a very long time. Saying that, in World War I specifically, soldiers needed a bomb that could be handheld. Now, we're not talking about artillery shells or anything like that. We're talking a bomb that can be held in the hand and flung at an enemy. The only problem is nothing actually existed. During the Great War, the idea was that there would be warfare on a mobile front, and it would involve vast amounts of people firing each other. One of the reasons why soldiers were taught what was referred to as musketry, firing in lines, for example, even up to the start of the First World War. But in places like Gallipoli, for example, soldiers began making their own bombs or grenades. And what they came up with is taking a tin, for example, a tin that had meat in, a tin that had milk in, a tin that had anything in. The most popular being the Ticklers tins that had things like jam and marmalade in, as you can see here. And when the food, the consumable, was eaten, they got hold of, for example, blasting dynamite or any form of explosive that they could get hold of, putting it in the centre of the tin, as you can see here, and then surrounding that with things like gun cotton, or even things like nails and scrap metal, basically. The fuse could then be lit, it could then be launched into an enemy trench. And remember, this is very much like siege warfare, trench warfare. Ian already mentioned that in a previous video. And when these either roll into the trench or drop into the trench, they would then explode, sending all the bits of metal, the nuts, bolts, nails and whatever into the soldiers inside. And remember, it is an anti-personnel weapon used in confined spaces usually. They even invented a catapult for these, where you would pull the thing back, sit it inside, let it go, and then fire it into the German trenches as well. And the problem with these, they were pretty dangerous things. They had a problem with the fuse, and they could also be put out. But saying that, that began a huge amount of experimentation. By 1915, 1916, they were coming up with all sorts of things. They actually created an official bomb, like this one here. This is actually what is referred to as a double cylinder hand grenade, and as you can see below that, it says improved pattern. So this is meant to be a much safer weapon than the earlier, what was referred to as Ticklers artillery or jam tin bombs. And then they also created quite a few stick bombs as such, really, stick grenades, which actually the Germans develop even further. I have one here. So what you have is a large wooden cane, a streamer to help it fly in the direction that you want it to, and then we have the explosive at the top there, and we've even got some fragmentary ironwork around the top, and these are used by pulling the pin, twisting the top. The cap has to come off because this is a percussion cap, so this has to go off by landing on its end and then exploding. But there was a lot of different types of these. Some had short handles, some had long handles, a vast amount of brass and ironwork basically, but they're an absolutely big development after the tin bombs as such, really. They were classified as dangerous. A lot of people didn't like using them, mainly because they were percussion devices, so if you do accidentally bang it heavily on the top, they could go off. And then as time went by, you get the invention of what is often referred to as the Mills bomb, which is the hand grenade that stays standard for a very, very long time, up to relatively modern times. And that is the one that everyone would be able to recognise. Everyone recognises the Mills bomb or the hand grenade, and these are very, very good things because these did not require a percussion cap, not externally anyway, and they didn't require a fuse to be lit. Now, I have a training hand grenade, which is this one, and I call it a training hand grenade. I do have other ones, but this is my training one, and this was given to me by a member of the Worcester Home Guard, and he actually used it for training other members of the Home Guard in the Second World War. So invented in the First World War, but continued afterwards, like I said. And the reason why it's a training grenade is because on the outside it is officially a grenade, but it's actually split down on the inside, so you can actually see the workings of it. So on the top you have a handle which is not actually held on as such. In other words, it's not attached to the grenade. The handle is literally resting under a little hook. Now, I don't know if you can see, at the one end, there is a tiny little V cut into the silver bit there. So that silver bit has a little cut into it, and you will notice the handle is resting underneath that little cutout. That handle is then held on by the pin, so the pin holds the handle down, and like I said, the handle is not attached as such. Now there is a spring that runs into the hand grenade itself, and the red painted area would hold the explosive. So what happens is, when you pull the pin out of the hand grenade, you must hold that handle down, because remember, it's the pin that's holding the handle. So once you pull the pin out, the handle is held down. But as soon as you let it go, as soon as you throw it, the spring that you can see in the body of the grenade there, the spring actually has to go down because there's nothing holding it anymore. And that flicks the handle off, and that handle will fly completely off. That little metal bit at the top there with the V cut in it has nothing holding it. So the spring fires that down, and it then hits that little bit at the bottom, which is actually the fuse, and that sets the fuse off. That fuse, as you can see, moves into here, and then the whole thing will go bang after a few seconds. And that's how hand grenades work, basically. And that is really where I'm going to leave the story, because that's the hand grenade that we would recognise. But it's interesting, the long history of one of those weapons. And remember, it was only resurrected in World War One, because there was, in a way, siege warfare. Because you have to look, when you think of ancient Greek fire pots, for example, or even medieval fire pots, or Granados used in the 16th and 17th century, they work brilliantly in confined spaces, sieges basically. Because modern warfare in the 19th century was so open, they weren't really needed. But in World War One, with the invention of trench warfare, they were required again. And it is an interesting topic. Hand grenades, bombs that are held in the hand, used against people, anti-personnel use really. Anyway, on that note, hopefully you're having a fantastic Saturday. The sun's actually come out in Worcester, which is an amazing thing to see, and everything looks very, very spring-like. Also, we've also got the start of the lockdown rules being slowly decreasing, so that's something to look forward to, as well as the good weather. So on that note, have a fantastic Saturday, have a fantastic weekend, and we look forward to speaking to you tomorrow. Stay in, stay safe, and we'll see you then. Bye bye.